All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. Hello to everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this virtual conference, The Roles of Law, Religion, and Housing through the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. My name is Ariel Lieberman, and I am the managing editor of Canopy Forum and the Paul and Marianne Kuntz Scholar of Law and Religion here at the Center for the Study of Law and Religion based at Emory University in Atlanta. And we're excited to have such a distinguished group of scholars, practitioners, and community members presenting here today. I want to start with a few words of introduction before I turn it over to our conference organizer, Dr. Jolanda van der Vijver. The Center for the Study of Law and Religion is a nonpartisan and interdisciplinary research center founded in 1982 here at Emory. We publish the leading journal of law and religion in partnership with Cambridge University Press. We have multiple book series with presses as notable as Routledge, Brill, and Cambridge. And we have a network of over 100 affiliated faculty and have organized dozens of interdisciplinary conferences, such as the one we're all at here today. In 2019, we started Canopy Forum, a digital publication that attempts to bring some of our scholarship and scholarship from the wider field of law and religion to a wider audience. To truly act as a forum, it's important to bring together not only academics, but practitioners, community members, and interested writers from all over the world. We at Canopy are proud to say that we have published over 500 articles and have readers in every country in the world. This virtual conference is a great opportunity to continue this mission, gathering together and hearing from our distinguished groups of panelists who together cover a wide range of expertise and experiences. This will likely be different from most academic conferences that we might have participated in the past. Instead of sitting in a conference room, we're all coming together from our home offices all around the world. And instead of long presentations about articles that have not been published yet, each panelist will have 5 or 6 minutes to convey their main ideas. And each of these articles themselves have already been published on Canopy Forum's website and are available for you to explore. This event wouldn't be possible without the work of countless individuals and our amazing editorial team. And I want to thank Rachel Orbetta and Catherine Loftus for helping organize this event, as well as Chelsea Chen, Sierra Butler, and Irvi Valparetti. I also want to thank our Director of Digital Scholarship, John Bernau, and our Executive Director of the Center for the Study of Law and Religion, Whitney Barth, as well as Christy Green, our Associate Editor at Canopy Forum, who will be presenting a piece today at the conference. With this, I want to turn over the floor and offer a very special thanks to Dr. Jolanda van der Vijver, our visiting guest editor and symposium organizer. Dr. van der Vijver is a practicing architect and academic with an interest in the convergence of law, religion, and architecture. She held the Emory Hale Fulbright Distinguished Chair South Africa in 2021 and is an active member of both the International and the African Consortium of Law and Religion Studies. She has published numerous peer-reviewed articles over her storied career and has been instrumental in the development of this conference that we all have the privilege of enjoying today. The idea for this conference emerged a few months ago in a conversation between Dr. van der Vijver and our team. Architecture and the built environment impact the well-being of societies, shape the future of societies, and also play a role in increasing social inequalities. Recent natural disasters have led to mass migration, a shortage of affordable housing, and a global increase in unhoused persons. The promise of the UN Sustainable Development Goals was to leave no one behind. But how can this be realized? To what extent can law and architecture collaborate in framing the discussion on affordable and sustainable housing as a human right? What are the roles of law and religion in the plight of homelessness? And what is the next frontier in the discussion of sustainable and affordable housing to address new demands and challenges? We're so excited to begin tackling these questions and to welcome you all here today to think with us further. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jolanda van der Vijver.
Thank you very much. So good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'd like to welcome all the attendees from across the world to our Canopy Forum virtual conference housing symposium titled The Roles of Law, Religion and Housing through the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or the UN SDGs. My name, as Ari said, is Jolanda van der Vijver. I'm the conference organizer. Also, a very special thank you to our South African participants who are joining us on this public holiday. Today is Human Rights Day in South Africa, which marks 30 years of democracy. Our aim today is to address the global challenges of homelessness, housing policy, and housing vulnerability through the lens of the UN SDGs. The United Nations has identified 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, which include the world's best plans to end poverty, reduce inequalities, and ensure good health and well-being, as well as access to quality education, clean water, and sanitation, to name but a few. The aim of these goals is to call all countries to action, to promote prosperity and consideration for all people while protecting the planet. But the promise of the UN SDGs to leave no one behind can only be fulfilled if the critical issues of homelessness and the shortage of affordable housing in urban areas are addressed. Our distinguished panel of presenters represent a wide range of expertise and experience. This group of scholars and practitioners provide insight into interdisciplinary ways to respond to this crisis. As I received the research papers, I could see that an interesting narrative was starting to develop. The different discourses include how climate change migration increasingly causes global housing shortages through destruction of current habitable areas, how natural disasters and the unhousing of populations have exposed the connection between housing rights and civil and political rights, specifically the right to vote, how local community and stakeholder participation in architectural design could be applied to housing in previously disadvantaged communities, how the restoration of a historic inner city apartment building and its functioning religious space serves as a model for future housing projects, why the quest for fundamental right to housing has remained so elusive, how religious organizations provide support to the homeless in the inner city without providing actual housing, why land use and affordable housing policies need to be reformed in order to desegregate the city, and finally, why it is crucial to consider housing as a human right, which must also be extended to refugees. These narratives can be woven together into an interdisciplinary conversation about homelessness and housing hazards, one that would stimulate debates on the roles of law, religion, and the planning disciplines in the future of housing. Our first presenter is Helene de Tooy. Helene is completing a Master of Science in Sustainable Development at Uppsala University in Sweden. She spent the fall 2023-2024 semester at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam as an exchange student under the Erasmus Plus program, where she attended the law faculty for a minor in global justice, climate change, and migration. She holds a master's in architecture from the Tshwane University of Technology. In her thesis, she explored new build typologies for receiving, documenting, and housing asylum seekers safely and with dignity. She has been a practicing architect since 2011 and spent 5 years at the Development Bank of Southern Africa as a technical design expert in the Infrastructure Delivery Division. Her current academic interests meet at the intersection of the built environment, climate change, and human rights, and includes climate-induced migration and displacement. So thank you, Helene, for starting our webinar. Over to you.
Thank you, Yolanda. Good afternoon and good morning, John, Ariel, the panelists, and all the delegates. It's such a privilege to be part of this conversation. As a society, we are not meeting our climate mitigation goals. The Climate Action Tracker tracks 39 countries and the EU, covering around 85% of global emissions. This tracker found that we are consistently missing the goals of the Paris Agreement of 2015. Civil society, governments, and policymakers are unable to sufficiently restructure and implement mitigation action fast enough. So if policy adjustments and their effects are too late, what are we to do? So instead of trying to attempt further policy adjustments, we could simply accept the IPCC RCP 8.5 scenario and plan accordingly. The IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the UN's body for assessing the science related to climate change. In this scenario, RCP 8.5, Whilst and on the alarmist side of the spectrum, by the year 2100, many habitable areas might no longer exist or will become uninhabitable, which could result in human migration from current climate niches to new climate niches. The term climate niche is an ecological concept that speaks to the optimal, suitable combination of conditions in which an organism can satisfy the basics of feeding and reproduction. The human climate niche is positioned at a rather cool 13 to 15 degree annual mean. And while modern humans can control their living environments through technology with mechanical cooling systems, the most vulnerable and poor will not be able to live outside this human climate niche. So it's important to understand the religious aspects of climate change and its cultural origins, since religious institutions, people, and ideas influence the construction of the meaning of climate change. This must be an interfaith dialogue as different religions, systems interpret climate change differently, and some are caught up in denialist politics. For millennia, human populations have been migrating from undesirable, hostile, or unsustainable environments, literally to the proverbial greener pastures. The UNHCR identifies three major reasons for climate migration. First, sudden onset events such as storms, floods, and wildfires. Secondly, we've got slow onset events such as droughts, changes in precipitation patterns, and salination of freshwater rivers due to rising sea levels. Third, climate change-related conflict. A reduction in land area could most likely increase competition for resources and spark conflict. In a 2100 scenario, it is crucial to prepare the international community to accept displaced people and allow them access to pass through their territories to reach new land, new opportunities, and to create new settlements. The highest temperature on Earth can be found in equatorial areas. While the equatorial area's temperature increases to become uninhabitable, temperatures outside the 30-degree longitude could become much milder. Glaciers, ice-capped polar regions, Arctic tundra, and Greenland might be transformed as the temperature at the poles increases and the ice melts. Since glaciers often feature prominently in ritual practice, climate change may also be driving religious change. Communities who inhabit these affected areas might, in future, navigate environmental change through cosmological or theological modes of understanding. The polar tundra in Russia and Canada would be transformed into grasslands and savannas. Patagonia could have a temperate climate, such as the Mediterranean, and Western Antarctica could be the green forest and mountains reminiscent of New Zealand. As our urban landscapes will continue to change, municipalities need to prepare for climate change as well. Most cities have ambitious planning and development documents, but they often lack long-term strategies aimed at climate resilience. Uppsala municipality, where I live, for instance, is addressing the concept of a future city through outreach programs with residents. This future city vision is not just driven by the experts, but by those citizens who will live in this future city. But here's the general challenge about climate change. Slow onset climate events are just too abstract to fully comprehend and envisage the effects fully. But in Uppsala, the conversation has begun. Climate change raises unavoidable ethical questions. There is a wide range of engagement with climate change from various communities and traditions of religious thought. Research has focused more on empirical measures of religiosity. In North America, for instance, white American Republicans and evangelicals are more likely to be deniers of climate change. And Indigenous people often draw on religious or earth spirituality themes in political discourse. Our 17 US SDGs include the world's best plans to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. Our environment is changing rapidly, and while several adaptive strategies are already proposed, employed, funded, and in development to assist vulnerable communities, some climate events and their aftermath will not be mitigated by agile and adaptive strategies. We must accept that there will be mass migration within the next few decades and that new destination climate niches housing requirements will increase and intensify existing housing crises. In my current research, I'm curious as to how migrants manipulate and exploit existing infrastructure en route to a final destination. The investigation into housing opportunities and accommodation during the journey is an important component of the research. The outcome of the research could give us clues to enhance well-being, safety, and dignity during future mass climate migration journeys. Fully understanding climate change requires a broad interdisciplinary approach and consideration of its religious aspects, especially the way religion is involved in human experiences of and human responses to climate change. Climate change studies should include investigating how it is interpreted by religious patterns of mind and formations of practice. Science only cannot address issues such as migration, religion, justice, human rights, and international law on its own. Thank you, Yolanda.
Okay. Oops. Thank you, Elian. And to continue the conversation on climate change, migration, our next speaker is M. Christian Green, who is going to tell us how natural disasters and the unhousing of populations have exposed the connection between housing rights and civil and political rights, especially the right to vote. Christy Green is familiar to most of us. She's the editor and senior fellow of the Center for the Study of Law and Religion, or the CSLR. She is the co-editor and special content editor of the Journal of Law and Religion, associate editor of Canopy Forum, and publications manager of the African Consortium for Law and Religion Studies, or ICLAS. Christy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yolanda. Delighted to be here today and to see this symposium come together. As some of you know, it's taken us months to put this together. Yolanda and I and our Canopy Forum associates started talking about a symposium last fall and something that might bring the US South Africa together. And Yolanda and I quickly settled on housing, not only because of her own profession, but because of some actually activist work that I'm doing alongside my academic work as president of the League of Women Voters of the state of Louisiana in the US. And as many of you likely know, Louisiana has been ground zero for many of the phenomena that Ellen DeToit just spoke of. We're battered by Hurricane Katrina in 2005, which displaced many people from the city of New Orleans, many of whom have never returned. In 2020, just as the COVID pandemic was getting started, we were also slammed again by two hurricanes, Laura and Delta in the southwestern portion of Louisiana, which again displaced people. I am actually speaking from Louisiana now, from the city of Lafayette, which is positioned about midway between New Orleans and Houston along Interstate 10. So we're often a receiving city for people displaced by disaster. In fact, our former mayor during the Hurricane Laura Delta disasters expressed concern that bad actors might take advantage of our hospitality and refuse to open a shelter in our city. This contrasts with Hurricane Katrina in 2005, when our city actually hosted many people, hundreds of thousands, I believe, in a local stadium. And it's recently been the subject of an award-winning documentary, which I actually need to link to my Canopy Forum piece. So something will be coming to that essay soon. But my particular interest has been the effect of housing and homelessness or being unhoused on voting rights. I was in a webinar last fall with a national partner organization of the League of Women Voters, nonprofit Vote, and really just kind of in the middle of the presentation, out of the blue, the discussion turned to the problems of registering homeless people to vote. In the US, voting is highly dependent on where you reside. Most correspondence about registration for voting requires a physical address. In fact, most documentation about citizenship, whether it's an ID card or your driver's license, also depends on having a physical address. So when people lose their housing, they often lose access to being able to acquire and renew these very basic citizenship documents. So in my state, we actually had a meeting of the League of Women Voters with one of our local regional homeless advocates who pointed out all of these problems and told us if we were going to get into this business of registering unhoused people, we would need to be informed about how to work with traumatized populations. That's how serious the problem is. So this has prompted me, with my background in international human rights, to look back at where housing has manifested in international human rights documents. And it goes back to the origins. Housing is mentioned in 1948 in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In the 60s, in 1966, we had the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. In 69, there was the Declaration on Social Progress and Development. And then in 76 and 96, there were the two big habitat conferences, as they're known. This is the UN Conference on Human Settlements and Sustainable Urban Development. So this has been a big of attention in international law. Interestingly, particularly in the US, economic, social, and cultural rights are often seen as different from civil and political rights. The US has famously or infamously, depending on your view, both signed and ratified the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. Every time I talk on this topic, I check Google to see if we've ratified the International Covenant on Economic and Social Cultural Rights. And to this day, the US is one of just a handful of states around the world which has not. So the purpose of my essay is to draw attention to this crucial intersection between housing rights and civil rights, and to put that on the table for further discussion. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Christy. And I would like to link this to our next speaker, who is going to talk about how local community and stakeholder participation in architectural design could be applied to housing in previously disadvantaged communities. Our next speaker, Karen Smuts, received a BA and a BArch from the University of Cape Town, UCT, and just completed her master's research at the University of the Free State. So congratulations, Karen. She is a founding member of the award-winning architectural practice, CS Studio Architects. Her practice is the subject of a publication, a 2016 publication, CS Studio Architects, Karen Smuts and Urs Schmidt. Karen, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thanks, Yolanda, and thank you all for inviting me to be part of this exciting conversation. I'm going to talk about participation because I'm a real strong believer that it's something that brings all these dreams and goals to the people. It actually brings it to where it matters. So I'm not going to specifically speak about the paper, but I'm rather going to show you some examples of where we have successfully been engaged in participatory processes in more public buildings, which then has a spin-off onto sorry, I can't get this to go forward. Okay, where did you go? So we are located in South Africa, where we have 12 official languages. And this makes it even more important that we should listen and participate. I think our philosophy in our office has always been that sustainability is about social, economic, and environmental aspects. So when one of these legs are not there, the pot will fall. So it's a very simple little diagram that we use, and we do quite a lot of participatory processes. And we've done work in Africa, in many, many communities. We've done work in America, and we've done work in Europe. So it's not something that is specific to poverty and to poor communities. It actually seems to be a tool that can be used for collective problem solving. We also do it because it installs trust. and it installs empowerment, which allows people then to engage with their own development and actually accessing more development rights. So from the work we do, which is very grassroots, we work with people and we empower them to become stronger so that they can fight their own battles. This is an interesting workshop that we did in Sweden, in Hemakulen, with educators, architectural students, and 16 immigrants who were from 16 different countries. So here we come with a migration that people are moving all over the world, and we actually used participation as a problem-solving tool. The immigrants wanted a restaurant so that they could share their cultural, and here we tie back to this cultural, religious argument that people want to share. They've got something to offer. It's not about one person just putting the story on the table. Then much closer to Cape Town, 10 minutes from our city and where I'm sitting, we were called when about 38 young kids were killing each other in 1998 to come and work with the children and see if we can get them to stop killing each other. They were children from the age of 10 up to about in their late 20s. And it was a really sad situation, but we worked for 2 years, meeting with the youth, meeting with these young people, getting their ideas, finding out what the solution is for them. And it was an incredibly powerful process. This is the youth center that came out of it. Many of the young people landed up going to university and studying. And the young kids went up to school. So there were extramural activities, which normally was not in the community. And that gang fighting, those 4 gangs stopped fighting. No more kids got killed in that particular fight. But sadly, a new gangster arrived on the scene and broke the building down to the ground, which was terribly sad. Then another project quite close to that one is where we listened to the elderly, and the elderly wanted a round traditional hut, whilst the youth wanted something contemporary. And at the end of the day, we came up with this cone-shaped contemporary space, which everybody seems to be happy with. This is a building in Langa. It's visited by thousands of tourists on a daily basis. The community, in a research with Gothenburg University, pointed this building out as their favorite, most safe space in the community. And a lot of activities and meetings happen here. Here you can see that young man with a white t-shirt was part of that youth project, Ulwazi, that I showed you in the beginning. So there's growth, it's sustainable. They keep on going and they keep on moving. These are just some of the tourists who come and buy. So that 3-legged pot, which I showed in the beginning, where we have the social, the environmental, and the economic, the thing needs to tie together. There needs to be economic activity so that people can look after themselves, sort out their own housing. In fact, that is what we were told by a lot of these community people. Just give us economic opportunities and we will sort out our housing. We would like to do that for ourselves. Here you can see an interactive open streets function outside the building. So it really brings people in and together. This is a project at the back of that one where we worked with about 2,000 people over a 2-year period to build a theater for young people and activity. And here you can see this is what the theater does. It brings in people, workshops, and it's an interactive space. And finally, this guy had a dream to make an aeroplane. And I think everybody has dreams. And somehow we need to tie the people's dreams back to the sustainability goals. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. And then our next speakers, Brendan Hart and Yasmin Mayat, are also going to discuss a very specific case study in South Africa. Yasmin Mayat and Brendan Hart both completed their professional architectural degrees at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, and their Master of Philosophy and in Conservation of the Built Environment at the University of Cape Town. They are founding principals of Mayat Hart Architects and Heritage Consultants, an award-winning architectural and heritage practice that combines architecture, research, conservation, and advocacy with considered projects that aim to respond to the rich and complex architectural and social history of South Africa. Both teach at the University of the Witwatersrand. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yolanda, for the introduction. Let me just share our screen. And thank you for the invitation.
So we're going to be talking today about a specific project. It's a building called Ayton Court that is located in Johannesburg. So Ayton Court is a modernist 1930s apartment building located in Hillbrow in Johannesburg. Now, Hillbrow is, many would say it's a notorious suburb in Johannesburg. It's established originally in the 1890s and becomes this very dense modernist townscape, one of the densest population densities in the whole of Africa. It's one of the first sites in Johannesburg, in South Africa, where apartheid segregation laws are broken and people of mixed races start living together. And the environment of Hillbrow has gone from this sort of modernist apartment townscape to a very cosmopolitan Pan-African
community within the African context.
So it's in this context that we found our building and the project took place. So first, to understand how this building emerged, Ayton Court is a modernist building. Modernism as a style of architecture emerges predominantly in Europe in the late 20s and early 30s, and very early on finds itself in the South African context with a group of young architects from the University of the Witwatersrand making contact with French modernist architect Le Corbusier and creating these modern white box villas in the Highveld landscape.
Which you can see is not exactly the best application of the style, but they somehow managed to adapt it to the South African context.
So these are pioneering buildings architecturally, internationally, not just in South Africa. So this is the sort of architectural background in which we find this specific building being created. So the building we're looking at is Ayton Court.
Yeah, so it was built around 1937, and you can see it within the Hillbrow context at the time. It was still the beginnings of the high-rise, so it was still relatively low-rise and suburban.
So the building is built as this highly efficient modernist form of housing. It's the building as a machine, as Le Corbusier would have said. It's minimal space. It's these two parallel blocks, compact single-bedroom apartments, or on higher floors, rooms with shared ablution facilities on a site that would have originally housed a single suburban home for a middle-class family.
Yeah, it also has roof space and interaction areas.
So the building over time evolves and develops socially. So structurally, the building stays relatively the same, but socially it changes over time. Due to economic reasons, the huge housing oversupply, the building falls into a state of disrepair. It becomes one of the first spaces in Johannesburg to have mixed residences. So people who are black, white, mixed race, all living in the same building, flouting apartheid law. It's also during this period that the building houses anti-apartheid activists, as well as establishes a mosque on the building's ground floor.
Yeah, it was quite an avant-garde space, which attracted generally a much more liberal resident, artists, professionals, and as Brendan said, a lot of anti-apartheid activists who stayed there.
So from the late 1980s onwards, the building fell into a state of disrepair and decline. So by the time we were approached by the building's new owner, who is a commercial property developer, to come and have a look at the restoration and repair of the building, it had been hijacked, which basically means the legal owner had been effectively thrown out by a group of tenants and illegal occupiers of the building, and had fallen into an extreme state of disrepair.
And obviously in dire need of help and maintenance.
Now, what the challenge we had is that this building is considered to have quite significant heritage value, both because of its architectural significance, as well as because of its social significance in post-apartheid South Africa. But it is in a state of disrepair. Then we also have the challenge of our client being a commercial property developer, wanting to meet certain financial goals.
Yeah, and minimum requirements so that he could let out the apartments as soon as possible.
And incredibly tight budgets. I think the per apartment budget was $1,000 for the repair and restoration work. So what we're doing is balancing repair and restoration with
sustainable and economical design.
So we are using restoration as a tool for recreating the housing. We're looking at the qualities of this housing. Why did it work? Why was it successful in 1937? Why was it internationally published? And exploiting those to make contemporary housing for a lower to middle income apartment dwellers. So you can see we've restored the building. The approach was to try and take it back to what it was.
Yes, and not obviously in the traditional, I would say, first world restoration approach. We were able to bring back a lot of the key elements, but still make it very usable for modern tenants.
So this is, in many ways, restoration we'd like to call it small R, not capital R restoration. This is restoration that is gritty, that is hands-on, that is low cost, but is looking at values.
So we reinstated the courtyard, brought back some of the water features, and also really petitioned to reinstate the mosque in the ground floor, which provided a very important social anchor to the space, as well as the tone for the area downstairs.
So what has happened with the building subsequently is it's actually worked out to be very successful. The putting money into the regeneration of public spaces versus the private spaces has created a sense of community. When the building was being renovated between 2012 and 2014, we couldn't complete the apartments quick enough because tenants were filling them up as we went. And with the reinstatement of the mosque, it attracted and generated its own community. And visiting the building last year, the mosque has actually expanded. The mosque has now got its own madrasa and school in the building. So it's really this self-sustaining community. And part of that, we've also tried to speak about.
Yeah, a bit of the history, including some information panels for the residents, so they could understand some of the heritage which was attached to the building and some of the important aspects of it.
So this forms a permanent exhibition in the foyer of the building to try and engender this idea of the building has value, the building is important, and the residents, even though they're paying very low rentals, they are quite a high turnover of residents. There's a sense of pride in the building. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much for showing us how the restoration of this inner city apartment building and its functioning religious space serves as a model for future housing projects. We are now going to return to the United States, and our next speaker is one of the CSLR's own, Terry Montague. We're so happy that you are able to join us today. She is a McDonald Distinguished Senior Fellow and Senior Lecturer in Law at Emory University School of Law and a Distinguished Fellow with the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University. She holds a Doctor of Law and a Master in Theological Studies, Sustainability, Environmental Ethics from Emory University, a Master in City Planning, Housing and Economic Development, and a Master of Science in Real Estate Development, Real Estate Finance and Development, both from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Thanks, Terry.
Thank you, Yolanda, and for the conference conveners for the opportunity to participate today. I think this is such a timely conversation. In the course of my preparations, I noticed that the World Housing Forum convening in Cairo, Egypt in November is taking on the theme, It All Starts at Home. And so we are indeed in good company and hopefully stimulating and participating in an even larger debate about the significance of housing and ways to combat homelessness. Adequate housing is a human right enshrined in international law. The importance of adequate and affordable housing for health and well-being, for poverty alleviation, and for sustainable cities and communities is well recognized in public discourse, national policy regimes, and international treaties and conventions. The UN stipulates 7 criteria for adequate housing: legal security of tenure, availability of services and infrastructure, affordability, habitability, accessibility, location, and cultural adequacy. And it approaches housing as integrative and more than a simple matter of shelter. As Christy Green has already rehearsed for us in detail, despite international recognition of a human right to housing, the US has yet to ratify these conventions or formalize a legal right to housing. Meanwhile, new actors, approaches, and corporate capital sources gaining dominance in housing markets are making unprecedented demands on communities and housing consumers that expose vulnerabilities in current housing systems in and beyond the US. These developments, I argue, intensify the need to translate the human right to housing into an enforceable legal right to housing. My essay essentially frames and engages the right to housing debate as it has been framed in the US. And what I have discovered is that many of the arguments over the last several decades have become outmoded and no longer match the realities in the housing sector. And so I discuss key advantages and disadvantages of situating housing entitlement within a human rights framework. Essentially, calls for a legal right to housing result from stark housing realities and inequities. Today, more than 1.6 billion people worldwide are inadequately housed, and up to 150 million people are homeless. 1 in 4 people globally live in conditions harmful to their health, safety, and prosperity. And by 2030, an estimated 3 billion people, roughly 40% of the world's population, are projected to need access to adequate housing. In the US alone, only 1 in 4 eligible households receives needed federal housing assistance. And there are 650,000 unsheltered homeless persons with projected housing shortfalls of up to 7 million housing units. This especially burdens low-wealth households and marginalized communities. These complementary issues and conditions have caused housing advocates to begin appropriating the right to housing as a human legal right to stimulate greater commitment to social and economic justice. And we know that the core tenets of human rights to housing are that individuals, by virtue of their humanity, not their social or economic status, are entitled to certain minimum forms of shelter, security of tenure, dignity, connection to communities, and opportunities that allow for their human flourishing. The UDHR takes a progressive approach that leaves wide discretion regarding the elements and pace for nation states to implement the mandate for a human right to housing. Nevertheless, there is an emerging taxonomy of approaches and vital lessons to harvest from the human right to housing expressed in the 189 national constitutions for United Nations member states, which foreground the challenges and prove the potential for positive impact. Even those experiencing mixed results on the ground provide important learning for newer democracies and the US. In the US, dual and dueling visions and narratives converge in the right to housing debate. Proponents of the legal right to housing tend to argue from a normative and philosophical posture that emphasizes the wisdom and justice of a home guarantee, coupled with practical cost-benefit reasons that seek to relieve those living unsheltered and without adequate housing conditions. They stress the direct and indirect costs of not fulfilling a right to housing in the US and how it undermines citizenship in a democratic society where political rights are heavily dependent on property ownership and economic rights. Opponents to the legal right to housing criticize the fact that housing markets are too complicated to implement the right to housing, and implementation would be too costly and the benefits too uncertain to make doing so feasible. They dismiss the importance of such a right because of the growing pantheon of housing rights that already exist at the state and local levels of government. Still others equate the right to housing with a mandate to provide a home free of charge to all who ask, and they worry that this will create disincentives to work. The opponents also emphasize the supposed political infeasibility due to inability to gain consensus in a polarized Congress and society. Additionally, they contend that international housing rights exist more in law than in fact, and such legal recognition has been rarely translated into effective domestic legislative and policy implementation. Ultimately, I argue that the quest for housing remains elusive because there's a lack of consensus on the goals and definition of such a right. because the discussions of legal right to housing revives a long-standing controversy over whether the US Constitution indeed authorizes entitlements for social and economic rights, including shelter rights. And the US Supreme Court jurisprudence, or rather interpretations of it, tends to complicate housing advocacy efforts. Thus far, the US Supreme Court has declined to find an explicit constitutional basis for a legal right to adequate housing or a guarantee to dwellings of a particular quality. While some legal advocates argue that this court decision, Lindsay versus Normette, forecloses a right to housing only of a particular quality, others interpret it as entirely closing the possibility of judicial recognition of a constitutional right to housing. And then there are the harbored myths and misconceptions on the nature and practicality and costs involved in effecting such a right. Nevertheless, I argue that the time is ripe for us, as communities of neighbors and of nations, to move beyond the declarations to responsive discourse and policy decisions, and to move beyond investigation to interventions that concretely advance a legal right to housing. Already there are impressive gains in housing rights in the US. That US legal advocacy has won since it began using human rights arguments to advance legal housing rights and remedies for under and unhoused persons and families in the US. These developments and the impulses and innovations that belie them give me cause and should give us cause for optimism that in realizing a legally enforceable right to housing, we will at last bring housing home, making a legal human right to housing less elusive and more fully attainable for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Terry Montague. Our next speaker is going to continue this conversation. Marianne de Klerk is also an MIT grad. She's an architect and an urban designer with 25 years experience working on a wide range of projects in South Africa, the United States, and Asia. She holds a Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Pretoria, was awarded a Fulbright scholarship, and subsequently obtained 2 master's degrees in architecture and urban planning from MIT in the USA. She brings a multidisciplinary approach to her practice, with projects ranging from regional and urban revitalization initiatives to individual buildings. Marianne, the floor is yours.
Okay. Sorry, just give me a second. I just need to. There you go. Is that visible?
Yeah, looks
yes,
great.
You can see your
Okay,
presentation.
yes, thank you. My apologies. I had a bit of a problem with getting things to run on my computer today, so I've switched to the iPad. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this forum. Today I'm going to talk about homelessness in the inner city of Pretoria. And in order to understand that and illustrate how homelessness is being addressed, I'm going to look at the specifics, case study at the Akanani Homelessness Center in the inner city of Pretoria. And I'm going to contextualize it by looking at the historical and current spatial patterns and use of the inner city. Just, there you go. This is the historic core of Pretoria. This is a historic map just to show you the typical colonial grid that Pretoria developed on, and we are going to focus on this area, obviously, in a contemporary sense. Inner city in the 1950s, before apartheid was officially promulgated, is very important to consider because the changes has been quite extraordinary with the implementation of the segregation laws. Please take note of the 2 areas I'm going to focus on today: the Burgers Park, where the Akanani drop-in center is situated, and then Marabastad, which is a historic settlement for Black, Asian, and colored people in the city, and how that was affected by special practices in South Africa with the advent of apartheid. Now, apartheid city model was developed in order to segregate people with the historic core, white neighborhoods around it, and then the buffers of industrial and mining areas, and then the townships for for colored and black Indian people on the periphery. And that model was very vigorously enforced with Pretoria as well. If you remember the Maraba Stad section that I referred to previously, this is an indication of how that area was, and it was a very vital, very lively urban area, was destructed over the course of a century through these forced removals and the destruction of urban fabric. People were moved to the peripheries of the cities. This area, this is Atteridgeville that I'm referring to, which you can see that to your left. Again, very much on the periphery of the city. You can see the industrial belts of Isco to the right, and then even if you go quite a bit then towards the east, you would have the historic core. So people had to travel long distances to get to work. Another device that was very effectively used in order to implement these policies were these modernist infrastructure projects. This project was never fully implemented, the ring roads scheme of Pretoria, but it was designed in order to destroy Maraba Stad, which you see at the top left. And that was very successfully fought by the Indian traders who managed to very cleverly utilize existing laws in order to keep their businesses. But again, these projects caused huge destruction and removed existing neighborhoods and communities who were not desired by the nationalist government at the time. The city also very rapidly modernized. You can see here, this is the center of the city, Church Square, in the 1930s. And then by the 1970s, it has become modernist, it's become monumental, and it's become this monofunctional modernist city that, structured by contemporary zoning laws. And this is just a view, a more recent view of the city today. So you can see there was a massive change in scale, but also in use, and it became a business district rather than a residential area. And this is something that has completely shifted since the advent of democracy in the 1994. Now, the inner city over that period in the 1990s started declining. It was mirrored by patterns internationally of inner city decline, but also the effect of things like sanctions and the flight of businesses from the inner city started to really take effect, with buildings becoming empty and upper floors not being used of buildings, only ground floors with retail. The city became a place of transience, with people coming to two train stations during the day, switching to the minibus taxis, which are so prevalent in that area, and then moving to their jobs in other parts of the city, with the city becoming a hub of government and then mostly transient workers. You can see here one of the cities, the Belombre station in Maraba Stad, and these areas also became magnets for homelessness. And you can see here mutual impacts from homelessness and the context, how these areas both degraded, were not being looked after, and as these areas became very empty, people moved in and started living there. Trade patterns also changed in the inner city with this advent of the new dispensation, and the completely new residents living in that area. The inner city went from 90% white to 90% black. It was not only a place of business anymore, but became a place of informal trade. People started living in buildings that were not being used for business anymore, and the residential densities really became much denser than it previously were, as Brendan and Yasmin also spoke about. Just to give you an idea of the informal trading that complemented the formal trading in the inner city, and these all serve these new workers that transited through the city, but also a way for homeless people who very often made a living through this informal trade. Soft infrastructure is something that came to fore in this area to support all these new vulnerable groups who started to get a foothold in this new dispensation, started to give them support. This was mostly for religious and private groups who gave medical support, provided food for people, gave them their shelters, and that really started creating this whole infrastructural system to support this new, more vulnerable, newly arrived groups to the inner city. Another thing that's very important that emerged in this period is that there is very many schools, both the typical public schools and then private schools, which serve this new emerging middle class And they took hold of existing buildings that weren't occupied by businesses anymore and established a number of private schools. And I'm going to show you one example, the Perea Park School, building definitely not designed for this purpose, but being occupied by a new, again, a new educational dispensation that ran parallel to the typical public government systems. So a very entrepreneurial approach. As our case study, looking at the Akanani, we're going to focus on this park that you can see below, the Burgers Park, which is a very famous old historic park in the city. And you focused in here. And this drop-in center, which I'm going to explain to you now how that functions, is a place where homeless men are helped to take their first steps out of homelessness. It is not a residential facility, but it is a place of support. And surrounding this park, and this takes me to this argument that the urban system helps homelessness if it is correctly situated and managed. It's surrounded by a number of high-density apartment buildings, which are now much more densely occupied than before, but also a number of social facilities providing houses for young, vulnerable people, for women who are abused, social housing for people on the lower income scale. And those all work together to create an enabling environment to support homeless people. One of the organizations that's very active, and they also, the Tswane Leadership Foundation, they also run the Akanani drop-in center, which is located in the park, are situated in that area with a red block. And they're part of the homelessness forum in the inner city. Half of the people who are homeless in Pretoria are actually in the inner city. So they provide support from these buildings. This is their headquarters. And then behind them is this facility called the Potter's House, where women in crisis with children who are escaping from abusive relationships are being helped, and they are housed here. So there is a larger network than just this one center that we're looking at today. Going back to the park and to Akanani, the center where the drop-in center is situated is here in the center of the park. I'm just focusing in. Here you can see it. It's an old historic pavilion that used to be a tea house, cafe, but the upper levels are now being used 2 times a week as a drop-in center for homeless men, and the lower levels have offices that support them writing CVs, working out independent development plans for them, and to help them to get a pathway out of homelessness. But this is, again, I want to stress, not a homeless facility. You can see this is being zoomed in. So people, again, they will be given advice how to take a next step. They will be given food and something to drink. This is a religious organization, so they'll be required to take part of devotions for a short time in the mornings. But it's an incredibly pleasant space, and it's also part of a very active, well-maintained park. You can see the park here itself. It is very actively used. There is some crime in the evenings, but it's a vital center of the city, and it's very interestingly, for a larger reference, also the point of, because it's close to the station as well, the point of many protests marches in the city starts here and then goes to the union buildings. It's part of a very established routes, mostly because the park's probably very pleasant, but it has that sort of, as a center and a starting point for protest, it has that historic role as well. Active play area for children in the communities around it. And then just overall very pleasant and well-maintained. And for the US viewers who don't know South African public parks, this is quite unusual for a park in a very stressed area to be this well used, well-maintained, and to be quite safe. And interesting to be a point of the first step out of homelessness for homeless men. These homeless men are reached at night when people who are part of Akanani go out into the streets. They find homeless people sleeping on the streets, and in this case, men, and they invite them to Akanani in the mornings. And I haven't spoken to the gentleman who runs this center. He says he has never had issues where he's felt safe or he felt threatened by crime, because they are known to help people, so they are respected and left alone. And it's the same for doctors who dispense street medicine. Just to give you an idea, just to conclude, it is a dense, well-maintained urban area that's well occupied. Very much part of the inner city. This part of the inner city is more residential, and it's very well used. Now, I just want to briefly look at homelessness. I'm not focusing on this, but just a brief comparison to homelessness in the USA. which has, especially since COVID, really skyrocketed. Now, unsheltered homelessness is on the rise, more shelter beds added in response, but always like South Africa, and especially with these groups who are doing fantastic work, it's never enough. What they do work, but they just never have enough resources. What the US do have, which is not successful in South Africa so much, which barely exists with our shelters, there is a housing first policy where there are programs to get people into housing and to support them in it. But the first step to formal housing, which is the permanent supportive housing, is much more difficult, and that is more focused on people who have a permanent income. So there is, and this traditional method of transitional housing is in decline. And so there is quite a housing crisis in the US, but it's nothing compared to South Africa, where the one shelter that does exist, which is the Struben Street shelter we're not looking at today, is an incredibly dangerous, corrupt place to live in, and likely a very big fire hazard for people who know. That's recently happened in Johannesburg. It's unsafe buildings where homeless people are basically stuffed in and not looked after. That is the institutional response by the government. These organizations who look privately at is much more successful. Now, just to conclude, homelessness is not about providing housing, but it's to restore dignity to people. And an organization like Akanani does not provide housing, but it helps people to get out of this situation. And that's incredibly important. So what is also very important is the supportive urban context for Akanani. And this drop-in center would never work if it was on its own. It is supported by a much larger urban system that is inviting to it, but also a mostly private institutional and religious system that supports homeless people. And that's important. And that is the soft infrastructure network that I'm talking about. As an urban designer, I would like to say planning and urban frameworks really need to address this in their frameworks and to really deal with specific areas where you can accommodate homelessness. Not only to try and almost push people out of that area, which has been the municipality's approach, but to help them where they are, because they often work there and they just cannot afford housing. This is not about only drug use, but it is about people who simply don't earn enough to be able to afford housing. And that's why I'm saying, and making the argument that Akanani presents a very good model for overcoming homelessness, but more facilities are needed, and we need to prioritize our funding towards these type of facilities. The answers is there, but the resources are not. And I'm going to conclude with that. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Marianne. Marianne has given us a historic overview of how segregation was created, specifically in South Africa. And I know there are parallels with the US. And our next speaker is Alexander Ehrlich, who has lectured jurisprudence in the Faculty of Law at the University of Pretoria and worked as a researcher on socio-economic rights and mining-affected communities with NGOs. He currently works on legal and philosophical aspects of land reform and privacy protection while pursuing postgraduate work. Now, Zander writes in his personal capacity, and today he is going to tell us why land use and affordable housing policies need to be reformed in order to desegregate the city. Thanks, Zander.
Thanks very much. All right. Thank you so much, Yolanda, for the invitation and for putting together this wonderful event, to all of the organizers as well. So any person who works in, not even works in South African urban design and spatial design, or has an interest in that, but any person in South Africa will know a scene like this. So this is Primrose and Makhouse in Johannesburg, two suburbs. So segregation is still a central feature of the South African urban landscape. So yes, it's still extremely racialized. We've got the apartheid history of racial segregation, but really there are many levels of segregation. And the central question really is 30 years after apartheid and even longer and in the longest space of time, many special apartheid legislative instruments repeal, why do we still sit with this enormous problem of segregation? So we're obviously with this central question in mind that anyone would have. I had the opportunity of reviewing the draft Tshwane land use scheme. Tshwane is the municipal name for the South African capital, Pretoria, and it's sort of the greater Pretoria area. And two maps struck me in the land use scheme. Now, the land use scheme is really the town planning scheme. So here we have Waterkloof Ridge. And obviously accompanying this map is lots of rules, town planning rules for certain zoning arrangements that are made that tell you can't have this kind of use in an area. And yes, obviously that's visible on this map. But another thing that is very obvious on this map is the kind of a uniformity in land plot sizes. So the residential land plots here all have a minimum size and a maximum density that's enforced through sort of coverage caps and those kinds of things. Now, if you compare that with this map, which is the map of Sunnyside.
Yolanda, I'm just going to interrupt you briefly. Your maps aren't we can't see your slideshow. So we're still stuck on the first map. I don't know if you can see. We just, yes, now it's moving. Okay. Sorry to interrupt you.
Let me rather do this. I'll rather use this rather than the presentation. I wonder if it thinks there's a different.
It actually moves now, so we can see the different maps. Perfect.
Okay, so this is the Waterkloof Ridge map that I spoke about earlier, and this is the Sunnyside map. So immediately, what struck me about these maps is a couple of reasons. So there's a great diversity here in Sunnyside that you don't see. Perhaps we can just go get to a scale. And this is a roughly sort of scale matched comparison of two parts of that map. So there's a great diversity on the right in the Sunnyside map. Despite there being any indication here of mixed use. So to me, what I want you to see here at the moment is that it's not a mixed use issue necessarily, just a mixed use area. So mixed use just means that it's not just a residential area. There might be a corner shop allowed and a hairdresser and whatever. Yes, of course, that is at work here. But even in mixed use developments, we still see economic, and again, because economic segregation has this racial historical component with it, racial segregation in newer mixed use developments, all across the city, whether it's Hatfield or in the new further east developments like Menden Main or whatever, you still see this segregating effect. So I don't think that mixed use really nails what is the segregating issue here. What you can see here is the mixture in the forms that goes along with mixture of uses. So in Sunnyside, you've got a great variety of plot sizes. And if we move on which you don't see in Waterkloof Ridge, and if we move on to the satellite photograph as well, you can quite clearly see that if you look over here, for instance, you've got a mixture of that is a complex, sort of non-detached houses all together. You've got larger blocks of flats there, and you've got normal residential houses, and speckled in between these, every now and again, you see a residential house like over here as well. So you've got a great diversity, not necessarily in uses, but in the forms of land use, of how that land is used. Now, if we go back just a little bit to this here, mixed density thus plays a great role. And the mechanism by which segregation, in a certain sense, this isn't the only thing going on. Therefore, my hypothesis is that these homogeneous kinds of enclaves that you see here in Waterkloof Ridge are really enforced by certain land use conditions. Now, you've got a rich enclave like this, which means you've got a neighborhood where only affluent single families can really afford to stay. And less wealthy sojourners would not so easily be able to navigate this, partly because that means you don't have good integration of transit. It's very difficult to walk large stretches. You don't have very many people using these sidewalks, these pavements. So the existing Tshwane land use scheme prevents higher density development in upmarket suburbs by imposing certain caps on land coverage. This is what I've mentioned earlier. The recent normative literature is already quite clear on this position, and there seems to be a growing empirical consensus that density restrictions, this is a quote from Lenz and Monkkonen, open quote, density restrictions lead to increased income and racial segregation. Further, they say, spatial concentrations of poverty and wealth lead to unequal access to jobs, schools, and safe neighborhoods, and exacerbate negative life outcomes for low-income households. Sunnyside is a lower income neighborhood, higher density, but certainly very mixed density in the eastern parts of it. So instead of a homogeneous Waterkloof, you have a diversity in lot sizes, densities, and use. Small-scale shops and everyday amenities are within walking distance of all residents, making them accessible to those without cars. Housing is not segregated by income, as many kinds of housing exist in proximity, but at least not as strongly segregated, including traditional larger homes on their own plots right next to townhouse complexes and blocks of flats. Planning literature refers to similar suburbs as complete communities, characterized by the availability, roughly within 15 minutes walk, of all the daily necessities that someone would need. The integration of income groups in one space, different plot sizes and housing types and densities. Complete communities represent a drive for racial equity and spatial integration. And this is indeed visible in an area such as Sunnyside East, which sort of by accident bears many hallmarks of a complete community, where a great diversity of ethnic, religious, and income groups live in the same neighborhood. So compare what exists kind of by accident by what has been destroyed and what was purposely a part of the larger project of apartheid, of spatial apartheid, grand spatial apartheid. The enemy were these well-integrated religious, ethnic, and racial areas. Some examples from the United States include the county of Montgomery in Maryland, which embarked on a desegregating policy initiative with its plan for complete communities. The plan acknowledged that, open quote, the separation of uses and associated homogeneity in lot sizes, development standards, and building forms, coupled with the commitment to barriers, buffers, and transitions, which is also typical of apartheid spatial planning, had the effect, whether intentional or not, of discouraging connections among people and races, and reinforcing racial, social, and economic divisions between countries. What's interesting is, and I'm not aware of a court judgment that is as explicit as the New Jersey case of the Southern Burlington County versus the township of Mount Laurel. In that case, the municipal land use scheme, the equivalent of that, imposed the same sorts of minimum plot size, maximum coverage, and caps on density, to the extent that more affordable housing was completely banned in that municipal area. And the court decided that this affirmative action in favor of single-family detached dwellings, one house per lot, etc., had the effect of realistically allowing, open quote, only homes within the financial reach of persons of at least middle income. as the zoning areas required respectively minimum lot areas, read the rest for yourself. This affirmative action for the benefit of certain segments of the population, the court said, is in sharp contrast to the lack of action and indeed hostility with respect to affording an opportunity for decent housing for the township's own poor living in substandard accommodations. And that, needless to say, such requirements killed realistic housing for this group of low and moderate income families, being the plaintiffs in that case. Now, the court mentioned that such a homogeneous community is kind of a not only boring, but the soulless kind of fossilizing community that really chokes out any growth. And I think South African apartheid urban planning was characterized by the overt and covert pursuit of racial and economic segregation and exclusion, with not co-opting these kinds of practices, but certainly requiring them. And while the grander spatial apartheid legislation might have gone away, we still sit with the nuts and bolts mechanisms by which the spatially segregating goals were achieved. So pursuing complete communities, and that's what I think is interesting about the case that I had just in Burlington case, is that it might be illegal to plan this way and to impose these kinds of obviously segregating land use conditions. And connecting with what Marianne had just mentioned, how do we undo this? So you must then include not only mixed use, but also mixed density. And I would argue as well social housing, so that on new developments, you impose the requirement that there would be the inclusion of affordable housing in that requirement that can help to address the issue of homelessness. So the most two prominent interventions that I hint at or suggest in the article include zoning reform to reverse the effect of land reservation in favor of the wealthy, and secondly, the adoption of broad, inclusive, and affordable housing initiatives, which do not further marginalize the urban poor.
Thanks, Sander. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you. And then I am your last speaker, so I'm not going to do a whole introduction because Ari has already done it. And I'm going to talk today about the housing plight of refugees. We've mentioned the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, which include the world's best plans to end poverty and hunger, ensure good health and well-being, quality education, and gender equality, to name but a few. But when it comes to housing refugees, especially in the urban landscape, the world is failing to keep the UN's promise to leave no one behind. There are many factors that contribute to this failure, but xenophobia, lack of political will, and an inability to enforce laws are contributing factors. Furthermore, even though all religions convey messages of charity, compassion, and care that extend to refugees, the current anti-immigration narrative and xenophobia towards foreign nationals often come from right-wing Christian religious groups across the globe. It is ironic that the formal humanitarian systems that developed in the 19th and 20th centuries were informed by these cultural and religious traditions. So in my essay, I briefly describe the link between religion and the development of Western humanitarianism. But for the purpose of my oral presentation, I would like to focus on a South African case where hundreds of asylum seekers and refugees, mainly from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or the DRC, started to camp out in protest on the public sidewalk in front of the offices of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or the UNHCR, in Pretoria. This was in October 2019 and followed deadly xenophobic attacks, which it was led by locals against foreign nationals. The global consensus is that refugees should be integrated in the host country's existing urban fabric and society. Their progression should be from emergency shelters and tent camps to full integration into society. But these refugees demanded to be moved to the safety of camps for protection and to then either be repatriated to their home country or relocated to safer countries. The sidewalks are public spaces that belong to the local municipality, but municipal officials claimed that the plight of the refugees was beyond their jurisdiction and that the Department of Home Affairs, the DHA, or the UNHCR should resolve the matter. The UNHCR told the demonstrators that it was not able to resettle or relocate them, since resettlement is a process that requires a third country to agree to admit the refugees and give them permanent residence. The protesters pitched domed tents on the sidewalk, and some residents and religious groups provided them with food and blankets. But 2 residents' associations went to court to have them removed from the upmarket neighborhood. The refugees were ordered to disperse and vacate the affected area within 3 days. Fearing forceful eviction, they made their way inside the UNHCR to demand protection. However, this only led to trespassing charges being pressed against them. And in November 2019, the South African Police Service, clad in riot gear, violently evicted about 700 refugees using water cannons and pepper spray. Hundreds, including women and children, were arrested and hundreds more were detained at the notorious Lindela Repatriation Center until the DHA could verify their immigration status and process them accordingly. Lindela has proved to be the worst kind of accommodation for refugees. It became synonymous with abuse, corruption, and systematic denial of basic rights, and riots, assaults, and deaths have been common. Management of the facility was outsourced to a private company, Busasa, that wanted to make as much money as possible from the DHA. They were paid per person per day, so there was a financial incentive to increase the number of inmates. The red brick fortification used to be a miners' hostel compound, housing synonymous with apartheid before it was turned into a holding facility. Small rooms in the male dormitory had to accommodate 26 men in double bunk beds and an additional 11 on mattresses on the floor between the beds. Tensions flared with overcrowding and disease spread quickly. Many of the protesters returned to the sidewalk in 2022. This time they had to manage with makeshift shelters. A bus stop was converted by draping large plastic sheets over the openings on all sides, and sheets or pieces of cloth were hung from the boundary wall and fence, which doubled as a washing line. The temporary structures made pedestrian traffic impossible. The refugees were once more removed in 2023, and the UNHCR in the meantime has built a wall on the sidewalk to stop future illegal squatting. So this story tells us that because the protesters demanded to be relocated to camps where the UNHCR could protect them against xenophobic attacks led by locals, this goes against the global trend where most refugees choose not to live in camps, but in urban areas, because camps tend to turn into prisons and have unsanitary conditions. Traditional emergency refugee camps are designed to be temporary shelters, but their lifespans often exceed what was planned for. The oldest refugee camp is the Palestinian camp Daeshe, built in 1949 for 3,400 Palestinians who fled the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. The UN built small shacks, but refugees did not want to live in those, so they built more durable structures. It now looks more like a permanent settlement than a temporary camp. One of the world's largest refugee camps is Kakuma in Kenya, where the average stay is 17 years. Architects Sandy Hillel and Alessandro Petti describe camps as paradigmatic representations of political failure, where refugees are stuck in time, waiting to be deported or relocated. Refugee camps should not exist. They represent a crime and a political failure. Camps are established with the intention of demolished. They are meant to have no history and no future. They are meant to be forgotten. So to conclude, the UNHCR does have emergency shelter solutions and standards that you can view on their website. And architects have been collaborating with UN Habitat to develop new shelter models that are applicable in large-scale housing programs for refugees. But designed shelters are not available to the refugee protesters if they are deemed to be illegal squatters. So the UNHCR does not offer recommendations on how cities and public space should serve refugees better. But without a formal housing policy, refugees are doomed to illegally occupy derelict or abandoned buildings in need of urban upgrade. In August 2023, a fire engulfed such a 5-story municipal-owned building in Johannesburg, killing at least 77 people, including 12 children. The building had been abandoned and hijacked by gangs who demanded rent from an estimated 400 squatters that included foreign nationals, economic migrants, and asylum seekers. Ultimately, it falls on humanitarian organizations and refugee advocates to provide asylum seekers and refugees with assistance and to facilitate the integration process. In South Africa, actions, investments, and activism to deal with homelessness come from non-profit, faith-based, and community-based organizations. So until architecture is seen as a human right, one that extends to refugees, the UN SDGs will remain unattainable. Thank you. Okay, so this brings us to the end of our webinar, and I can already see Christy's hand up. For those of you who are watching online, the articles, the link to the articles on the Canopy Forum has already been provided. And then I think Ari or John, you can let me know if there are any questions from the floor, but maybe Christy, we should give you the opportunity to speak.
Thank you. I kept my remarks a little bit slow, a little short rather, kind of selfishly so that I could benefit from all of these wonderful presentations. But these presentations really have actually made me think, as voting rights activists, we sort of came to this problem of, oh my, we've forgotten to register the homeless people as a sort of new thing. It sort of slapped us in the face. But hearing these presentations, I'm now getting a sense of how I, as a non-expert in housing, really have been thinking about this for some time. In the 2000s, my life was sort of transient, highly mobile as I was moving between various educational and work contexts. I remember when I left Chicago around 2003, I think this was within a year or two of the destruction of the Oakwood housing project, which was a very tall, one of those very austere looking housing projects that occupied prime real estate on Lakeshore Drive overlooking Lake Michigan. And I remember at the time there was a lot of news coverage about how sad former residents were of this notoriously dangerous and terrible housing project, that it was being torn down. And I had to sort of grapple with what that meant, that this terrible place had constituted a home for them. And then in 2005, I was actually teaching a course, 2006 rather. I was teaching a course on Hurricane Katrina when I was teaching at Harvard Divinity School. And I put this course together very quickly and tried to get as many guest lecturers as I could. And so one of the people who spoke to us was a doctoral student at HDS who was a New Testament scholar. And there have been a lot of criticism of cities after Katrina, often with, quite frankly, a racist connotation, that those cities like New Orleans had failed. They were just sort of cesspools of humanity that didn't take care of their people, and this is the kind of disaster that results. And so this graduate student was talking to us about images of the city in the Old Testament, and particularly the walls around cities, and how the worst thing in the world was to be left outside of the wall, for the city to not exercise hospitality in welcoming you within the wall, and how dangerous that was in the ancient Israel, in which some of our Abrahamic religions developed. And so hospitality actually became a theological framework that I started looking at, using to look at Katrina. And I think it's it's still one that's very applicable to the kinds of situations that we're discussing here. As the decade went on, in 2007, I moved back to Atlanta. I was back at Emory for 3 years, from 2007 to 2010. I arrived the fall before the housing crisis of 2008, which really it sparked the global economic downturn. And I remember as I was moving back to Atlanta, there were all of these new buildings, luxury housing, these banners proclaimed, luxury condominiums and apartment complexes. And as I drove around town at night, running various errands after work, I noticed there were very few lights in these buildings. They seemed sort of unoccupied. And later I found out that many of them were unoccupied. And also there was an article in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution about an Atlanta suburb that the building had stopped because of the financial crisis. And so there were just a few houses in what was projected to be a suburb of many houses, and the others sort of eerily had the gas and electricity connectors protruding from the ground. But one of the stories I remember told of an immigrant family from Latin America who had sort of been coerced into signing a contract that they probably had no idea of the contents of. And they were living in the bottom floor of a large McMansion, we call them, these large houses, because they couldn't afford furnishing for the second floor. And that this was actually kind of a common thing in some of these places where lower income people purchased housing way beyond their means. So the final point, and this goes back to Ellen's presentation, Louisiana, in addition to having these notable hurricane disasters, is wasting away. And we have had a Native American group in what was the Ile de Jean Charles. We're now becoming a community of islands at the base of the state as the Gulf of Coast and Gulf of Mexico encroaches. They have been moved at state expense to the mainland, because we now talk about mainland and islands in Louisiana, and it hasn't gone well. They don't feel at home. They felt like they've lost their connections to their traditions in the land. So there are many facets to this problem we're discussing. And thank you to all of you for helping me remember many of them.
Thank you, Christy. Yeah, I just want to add to that, because when Helene was starting to do research on how religion impacts on climate change, we discovered a Christian group living on a low-lying island, but with a very traditional animistic religion, and how they were starting to plan to build these floating towns and houses, because they were linking this to the Christian Noah's, the big flood and Noah's Ark. And that Helene was postulating that there might be future societies that would be living on the water, a little bit like our post-apocalyptic movies like Waterworld, etc. So, I mean, Cape Town, which is one of our favorite cities, I don't know, Karen, if you want to add anything on that. Cape Town is a low-lying city, and one that a lot of people are dooming because of climate change and rising sea levels.
Yeah, I mean, we have huge informal settlements that are encroaching on wetlands, which is another crisis. And yeah, and I think the other thing that we find in the Western Cape, never mind the water, is the fires. We have had over 50 fires in the last couple of months, and that just really wipes out huge tracts of already informal housing. So yeah, the informal is really being hit from all sides by climate and by other disasters. But yeah, in Cape Town, we've had the homeless problem is also enormous. And there's court cases where the government stand up against the poor street people and then have them evicted so that they can expand the tennis courts. And it's the same. What we know is the poor must make room for the rich, and the poor cannot squat on the sidewalk of the rich. So we have a lot of that in Cape Town.
Yeah, and I mean, an interesting point on refugees is that globally they're integrated into the community of the poor, and these are usually communities who can least afford to have extra people living in their communities and in their societies. And usually refugees and climate refugees, especially economic refugees as well, have basically lost everything. If we look at the war-torn countries of, the Gaza Strip at the moment in Ukraine, etc., people who leave these countries and flee because of conflict have nothing. So they are now reduced to poverty, and with COVID-19, this has increased the problem. Terry.
Yes, thank you so much for all of these comments. I was struck by the strong parallels between the United States and South Africa in terms of the legacy of racial bias and the realization that even after legal discrimination and legal segregation has been overturned, we still have such a strong continuing legacy, partly because the nature of housing. It's not fungible in the same way as other consumer goods. It takes a long time to build it, and there's a lot of inertia, and there are informal race brokers who are invested in maintaining existing spatial patterns. And so, to Alexander's comments in particular, I was struck by how those themes are coming to the fore here. Land use and zoning reform is a major thrust at the federal, state, and local level, where it's literally being reformulated across municipal governments to make land use planning and zoning not a constrainer, but a conductor of community. And so California alone has introduced, the state of California alone has introduced in the last year 215 bills to begin to try to change the whole infrastructure of housing. And just a kind of personal note, your mention of Montgomery County, I am the product of those changes in Montgomery County. My parents 51 years ago were both raised in segregated South of the United States, bought a home in Montgomery County, Maryland. And they were able, because of the appreciation of that home value, to raise their family, to let me, to finance our educations. They were kind of the first in their families. And so Montgomery County, Maryland is a great example. Strong schools that I would not have otherwise been able to attend. So interesting personal note. The other thing to note in the United States, particularly in the southern parts of the United States, 70% of the land that is zoned for single family, land that is zoned for residential use, outlaws anything but single family housing. And so that is the frontier, that it is illegal to build anything but single family housing on 70% of the land in the United States that is zoned for residential use. And until we address that and the stigma of rental housing, which unfortunately our Supreme Court has described as a parasite and a blemish on communities, until we reverse that mentality and the way we think about and talk about diverse housing forms and allow other kinds of typologies of housing, we're going to be stuck in the same housing crisis. So just want to make a comment on that.
Thank you very much. Marianne has her hand up. Marianne.
Thank you. I just wanted to turn on everything. I have 2 points to make here, but Terry just said I'm going to have to comment on. It is incredibly true that there's very strong parallels between the US and South Africa, especially if you look at post-war 1950s development. And I actually did a case study of that, comparing, when I was at graduate school, comparing what happened in the Bronx and what happened with South African apartheid laws, and how it's very interesting how those zoning laws, but also legislation that was intended to give veterans returning from the Second World War access to single-family housing in the suburbs, had very similar effects in segregation. So in South Africa, it was incredibly intentional to create segregation, but in the US, a lot of these well-intentioned laws, combined with modernist zoning and planning, resulted very often also in segregation and in neighborhoods that collapsed. So there's a whole world to explore there. But the second point I just want to address is this whole issue of environmental crisis and vulnerable people. And it's very often you find, and I learned that first working when I was in Boston, as poor, vulnerable people very often live in the most environmentally or polluted areas because they have no other options. It was not an accident during Katrina that the areas where the poor people lived were flooded because it was the most low-lying areas. So it is not an accident that people who are very poor often live in areas where they get sick because they live in polluted lands. They can't advocate. So spatial planning, where people live, where they're allowed to live, how they can advocate for themselves, are very, very interconnected. And people who are well off, who can afford good homes, very often don't have to deal with those problems, but people who have less resources then live in areas that are a lot less desirable and very often dangerous for them. And I think all these things work together. Is where are people forced to when they have little power or no voice? And I think we see that in South Africa, but we also see that in the States. And that was the 2 points I wanted to make. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Marianne. Before I get to Alexander, I just want to give Brendan and Yasmin the chance to comment, because your case study is a very specific one. And I mean, it would be wonderful. This is Johannesburg. It would be wonderful. And I also want to link this to what Zander was saying, is if that model could be used. And I mean, I want to say congratulations for pushing back against the developers who really just wanted a economically feasible development, because it was designed with so much sensitivity, and especially as heritage consultants. But what interested me the most of this project was the fact that you retained the mosque, and that the mosque was something which had a dual function. So on the one hand, it was a religious space, but on the other hand, it was the space of protest. Yeah, so I don't know if you want to just comment, because I know, Yasmin, you're going to leave us in about 7 minutes to break the fast. Yasmin is it's Ramadan. So before getting to Zander, I just want to give Brendan and Yasmin a chance to respond.
Thank you.
Thanks, Yolanda. I think maybe do you want to comment on the mosque?
Yeah, I mean, when we first, spoke to the developer, he obviously was completely against reinstating the mosque. And I think the only way we could really convince him was to try and convince him that by retaining the mosque, the kind of tone of the building would be retained in terms of one which was probably more conducive for families, one which had some sort of a more moral kind of units within that space, but also more of an educational and social welfare component. So the mosque, besides being a prayer space, also was providing facilities and also advice for people in those communities as a safe space, which I think was also a really lovely, exactly like Marianne was talking about in the park. So by providing those opportunities for people, which may not even have necessarily be Muslim people, but also helping the community as a whole. And in that way, I think really helping the building in its entirety to make sure that it would hopefully not in the future be hijacked again. I think that was probably the worst case scenario.
I think what was interesting with this project is we were constantly, they were balancing two sets of values. So there's the developer, it's a low-cost commercial developer. So they're working on incredibly tight budgets and incredibly small margins to get the building to work. And then we're trying to balance that against social values that we feel are important to the building, as well as the heritage values. So what we did is we had to find a way to speak to the person who's putting up the money in a language that they understood. So decisions that were perhaps had certain heritage values or implications, or the mosque, as Yasmin's been talking about, we would justify these through commercial reasoning. So commercially, it makes sense to do X, Y, and Z, but that also supports the heritage values. So it's trying to find ways of speaking to people in a language that they understand, in this case, returns on investment, but at the same time, achieving different goals through that. And it's not that everyone knows all of the goals that are achieved. As long as you give the developer, say, their end product that achieves their goals, they're happy. The heritage bodies in Johannesburg are happy because they get the restored building. The mosque and the community are happy. So it's understanding that complexity and how to speak to that complexity to the different individuals, understanding that not everyone shares the same set of goals.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Okay, sorry, Zander, are you still here? There you go.
Yes, on what Marianne had mentioned there, so I think, and that speaks to what Jasmine and Brendan was just talking about. So, what goal are we serving with certain land use conditions and with a certain policy and regulated framework in place? You are perpetuating this segregation. And unfortunately, discussions like a heritage discussion or a justification for keeping things the same based on an heritage value or preserving the character of a neighborhood and that kind of stuff is very often sort of code for maintaining segregation. So that really the profit incentive and all of that just it's the same thing by other sort of in other words. So that should change. That's the you shouldn't be doing the convincing. The policy and legislative framework should be saying, look, this is required of you to include certain social housing and affordable housing considerations and any other things that you might know better about in terms of heritage and sort of community and social considerations. But yeah, it's the law that should be changed from serving the segregating interests to desegregating.
Yeah, and policy. Thank you very much. So I don't see any other hands up. And I know that Ari is going to want to just thank the editorial team. So I just want to know, is there anyone else who would like to add anything? Or are we going to, Helene, are you? She's giving the thumbs up. So Ari, I'm going to hand the floor over to you.
Thank you, Yolanda, and thank you all so much for being here, for contributing to this conversation, and really sort of providing a really rich discussion that we can now continue into the future online and in our various forums. I want to thank as well the editorial team, as Yolanda suggests, once again for all of their hard work on this webinar and this symposium, and for bringing us all together, and to the audience as well for being a part of the conversation. I'd like to invite all of our audience members to send any questions or direct any comments to our speakers today through the links that John has just provided in the chat, and to be a part of continuing the discussion. Yeah, and thank you all very much for being here.
Yeah, well, thank you very much to Canopy Forum. It's been a huge honor. And I think it was difficult to do this remotely. So hopefully next time I can be right there in Atlanta. I think this was, it's a wonderful conversation starter. And this is going to hopefully, as you say, stimulate further conversation, especially an interdisciplinary one, because I think this is why our panel was so rich, is because we have architects, lawyers, urban designers, policymakers, etc. So yeah, thank you very much. And I will keep in touch via email. And I really appreciate your participation. It's Ramadan, it's Human Rights Day. The Americans have no excuse because it's still early in the morning. So thank you very much.
Thank you all very much.